we are recording this, so that way folks who may not be able to join in live today will be able to access this at a later point, or if you want to revisit any of the content from today, you can do so. My name is Brett Nackman with College Autism Network, the Director of Research. It's great to have you all on board. It's 2023, and we have a great slate of programming on the docket, and that begins today with Kayden Stockwell, who is a PhD student in the Department of Psychology at the University of Virginia, to talk about autistic students and campus climate at the University of Virginia. So I think that's going to be a real treat for everybody in attendance. If you haven't been to Canvas before, welcome. We have these monthly presentations as well as a listserv and other avenues for connection, whether you identify as a self-advocate, a researcher, an educator, a disability practitioner, an ally. We welcome you here as we have conversations around autism in post-secondary education. And as we begin all of our meetings, we usually have a little bit of an icebreaker activity. So we encourage you to use the chat, since it is the start of the new year, to share what are your New Year resolutions. So we welcome you to contribute some examples of that. You also, if you want to turn on your microphone and share those as well. We'll see what our Canvas community is aiming to accomplish this year. New Year resolutions. So we have journaling, eating healthier, reading more books, getting outside more. A lot of readers in the room, that doesn't surprise me. Walking more outside, decluttering, yes. Maybe beat that spring cleaning and start in January. Publishing your thesis, yes, Eleanor will be our presenter in February to talk about their work. So yes, that's a very good goal. Reading for fun, yes, Lori, what a reminder. We need to read stuff that we enjoy as well. Tom is mentioning exercising. Lots of really good contributions here. Self-organization, yeah. And resting, yep. Courtney, I think, puts it very well. All of the above, yes. I think we just need to continue to chip away at all of these different priorities. I certainly would like to read more for pleasure as well. Yeah, don't sweat the small stuff, says Wes. Yeah, that's something that so many of us can try to focus on, and putting things in perspective. Well, continue to add your contributions as we move forward. And we're going to kick right into our meeting. I also want to say to folks, and I know folks have already begun doing this in our meeting agenda, which I will link to in the agenda here, put a link in here. Do highlight your name if you're in attendance. I usually do that in advance, but several people have been here long enough to know that that's the trend. So I will be capturing that anyways as much as I can on my end. But if you can help me with that through highlighting your name, that definitely helps. So feel free to do that. Just a few general things here at Canvas. As always, if you're not on our listserv, please do that, so that way you are apprised of our forthcoming meetings, meeting minutes, and video recordings of these presentations. Those usually arrive in your inbox about a week after our meetings. But we also have seen quite a lot of research study opportunities, people seeking resources on various projects. And I inserted a few of the more recent ones that were posted in our meeting agenda, which we can briefly mention. But there's certainly a lot happening, and I encourage you to take a look at that as you have space. As College Autism Network is also a nonprofit, we welcome your membership, which entitles you to certain benefits and helps support our various efforts. There's no need to be a formal CAN member to engage in our programming, of course, but we do welcome you to entertain that thought if you're not already part of it. And since our esteemed leader at CAN, Lee Williams, is here, Dr. Lee Williams has an announcement, I think, related to our College Autism Summit. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Lee.
Thanks, Brett. Hi, everybody. So we have dates for the 7th College Autism Summit, October 18th to the 20th. It's going to be in Nashville on the campus of Vanderbilt University. And so mark your calendars. The Canvas listserv will have more information about a call for proposals, but we're pretty excited to be planning another edition of this really special conference. The other thing that I want to mention is that we are partnering with the Center for Neurodiversity, Employment and Innovation on a 3-part webinar series. For those of you who have some interest in the neurodiversity and employment space, this will be of interest to you, 3 one-hour webinars. And we're going to be meeting with employers, but it's really not the kind of dog and pony show about how great their neurodiversity hiring initiative is. We're really trying to map the landscape, the increasingly complex landscape of neurodiversity employment, and really help to really try and figure out some of the common language and ideas and goals that we have. So if you're interested in signing up for that, registration is limited, so do so quickly, and you can go right to the collegeautismnetwork.org website and you'll see the link for that. So we hope to see you. The dates are February 22nd, March 8th, and March 22nd. Thanks, Brett.
All right, thank you, Lee. And it's good to see you in your new house as well. So nice background. Thanks, Lee. All right, so yes, a lot of things to be excited about. And turning it over to all of you, we want to showcase some examples of resources and different opportunities. I see that Jill's, I think you're here, Jill, about a new article that you all published. I'm not sure if you want to briefly mention that. Otherwise, certainly there's a link in the meeting agenda.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Just wanted to share just some new work out that we did looking at how students on our campus manage perceptions of peer stigma. So kind of an area of interest for us, and then taking those results, and we're working on developing a neurodiversity alliance here. So if anyone's interested in reading, I put in a link that you should be able to directly access the article. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Jill. And I'm actually, Jill and her colleague presented at one of our Canvas meetings earlier last year. So you can see that video recording on our YouTube channel if you're interested in learning additional stuff. And some other research opportunities or research opportunities in general that were posted in just recent days on our listserv. Val Irwin out of Bowling Green State has a study on survivors of sexual assault with a disability. So that looks like a very meaningful work, and there's a hyperlink in our meeting agenda for that, as well as I'll be posting that link in the chat right now. And I see that Jennifer Williamson, working with Carly McMorris, is here seeking a scale. Jennifer, you're welcome to share some thoughts on that if you'd like, but otherwise, certainly there's your contact info in the meeting agenda.
Yeah. So I'll just quickly jump in. Can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So my master's thesis is focusing on better understanding the factors that impact mental health for autistic students attending higher education. So I'm still in the process of developing that and basically preparing my methodology for ethics and such, and want to finalize my measures. So if anyone has a measure that's related to measuring sort of the broader college environment in terms of inclusivity and acceptance of autism, and or a scale that looks at like autism stigma, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, there's a lot of folks in this space, so hopefully they can provide some feedback and direction there. Also, there was a research study opportunity posted by Alana McVeigh regarding recruiting autistic adults, DBT clinicians, DBT clinic leaders for a study on dialectical behavior therapy. So if you may know anyone who is eligible for that, Alana's email is in the meeting agenda, and I'll post that in the chat here as well. Opening it up to all of you, just because these items were already listed on the meeting agenda does not mean that we are limited to focusing on that. Are there other opportunities that folks want to point one another to, news items or recent publications to share, like Dr. Underhill demonstrated, or even just announcements or positive things to celebrate? This is a good space. All right, well, if there are items that folks want to share with the larger group, you're welcome to do that in the chat, and certainly our listserv. As I mentioned, several of these different points were posted on our listserv in recent days. So that is a good way to have it circulated to many hundreds of individuals around the world as well. So at this point, we are going to turn it over to our featured presenter, Kayden Stockwell. Really glad to have Kayden on board. Kayden's one of those, I think, rising stars in our autism research world and post-secondary education, and it's just a real pleasure to have you here. You have a great title for your presentation. I'm going to let you introduce yourself further, Kayden. We'll ask that folks reserve their questions for after Kayden's presentation, as well as you can put questions in the chat while Kayden's presenting, so that way they can be addressed shortly thereafter. So Kayden, it is over to you, and looking forward to it.
Great, thanks again for having me, Brett. I will put my presentation up. So hopefully you can see that. All right, great.
All good.
Great. So I'll start off with the disclaimer. You might hear my cat meowing in the background. He is exiled from my room because I've determined that he is not conducive to me focusing on presenting. So you may hear him interject. But again, hi, my name is Kayden Stockwell. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm a third-year developmental psychology PhD student at the University of Virginia. And today I'm going to be sharing a project that my lab mates and I started to understand the experiences of autistic students here at UVA. And for this presentation, I'll specifically focus on the findings that I developed for my master's thesis, which focused on a sub-question we asked of the data that we collected. And so I'll start us off with some of the background literature that was sort of at the forefront of our minds when we began this study. As a whole, in the literature, we were seeing what a lot of us know, and what I knew from my own experiences as an autistic undergraduate, that autistic college students are generally not receiving the support that they need to flourish in college. In terms of academics, the literature is mixed, but several studies suggest that autistic young adults can struggle to academically adjust to college. Outside of the classroom, many autistic students report being lonely and desiring more close relationships. And the sense of isolation and lack of social support structures that autistic students report isn't helped by the stigma that they can experience from non-autistic peers who consistently report a reduced desire to interact with autistic compared to other non-autistic peers. And additionally, autistic college students can find campus to be a hostile sensory environment. And so this can impact academic and social experiences. And further, a lot of autistic students report that they don't have access to any kind of like private, quiet space from which they can escape from all of the noise and activity. And so from sort of our survey of the literature, it was pretty clear to us that universities are generally not providing academic support And for this and other reasons, we were specifically looking to provide recommendations to UVA on how they could better support their population of autistic students. And so to quickly sort of take you through the methods of this project, we co-developed the interview questions and the interview guide with a neurodiverse team of researchers. We specifically brought on an autistic undergraduate from UVA to work with us on this project since they had insider knowledge that as non-autistic people or as graduate students, we may not have had access to. And after a pretty lengthy IRB process, we recruited participants through flyers, emailed to university clubs, the Disability Resource Office sent out emails for us, also through word of mouth. We offered participants the choice between focus group interviews, individual interviews, or asynchronous text-based interviews. We also offered to work with interested people individually if none of those options worked for them. No one ended up requesting that. And in the end, most interviews ended up being conducted individually, but this was more due to scheduling constraints than a specific preference for individual compared to group interviews. And over the 4 months that we were interviewing participants, we ended up with 14 people. Our sample was pretty evenly distributed in terms of gender. It was also primarily white. And other details that we thought might be relevant to consider in this space was if participants were registered with the Disability Resource Office, if they were a transfer student, and if they were a first-generation college student. And so once we had finished transcribing the interviews with these 14 participants, like I said, I spent a lot of time with this data as part of my master's thesis. This wasn't what the data that I had planned to do for my master's, but sometimes unexpected recruitment barriers means that you have to switch topics at somewhat the last minute. But I'm glad that it ended up that way because the months that I spent with this data ended up being really interesting to me, and I hope to you. And specifically to delve into the data, I decided to use reflexive thematic analysis, or RTA, and I chose this specific form of qualitative analysis as it allows for both deductive and inductive theme generation. So it allows for the analysis to be directed by existing concepts and the ideas from the literature, as well as from my own lived experience. And it also allows for themes to be directed by the content of the data. And so I used a mix of these deductive and inductive approaches as I was developing the themes. And practically, RTA was also appropriate just with our intention to deliver actionable recommendations to participants in university. And as some of you might know, a component of RTA and a lot of qualitative research is prior to the coding and constructing of themes, you spend a lot of time familiarizing yourself with the data. And it was during this time, it's possible for research questions to evolve or to narrow as points of analytic interest are noticed. And so it was during this data familiarization phase that my sort of master's thesis moved from our initial project motivation of very broadly understanding how autistic UVA students experience their time at the university, to noticing that participants either explicitly noted having difficulty with accessing information about resources and opportunities, or they shared experiences that suggested that they were looking for a certain resource or opportunity, but were under the impression it didn't exist. And then sometimes when we would go digging into these sort of requests for resources of opportunities, we would find that the university did offer some of these resources, but it seemed like our participants hadn't heard of them. And we also had some quantitative questions. We had participants fill out in a survey after the interview about some specific resources related to disability, and none of our participants had ever heard of them. And so from this, the specific focus of my master's thesis moved to understanding what factors might influence how autistic university students access information about resources and opportunities. And thanks to a really interesting conversation that I had with Dr. Kevin Mallory at Old Dominion University, I was finding that it might make sense to frame some of the findings some of the experiences participant shares and the themes that I was developing through information behavior theories. So this was allowing for consideration of individual behaviors, but also institutional factors that can influence how people access and engage with information. And so I'm just going to quickly go through a few terms that I'll use throughout today, just so people are on the same page. Information behavior. This is sort of activities related to searching and seeking that you can resolve your need for information. That can be sort of split up into formal information behaviors, just seeking, using, and sharing information for a specific purpose or to accomplish a specific task. So this might be asking a targeted question or looking up an article for a class project. And informal information behaviors, which is when you incidentally encounter information while you're engaged in something that's not focused on addressing an information need. So this might be, for example, maybe you're assigned to a group project and somebody else is talking about how they recently got summer funding through a university internship program. You didn't even know that there was an internship program or that internships could be paid. It can be this sort of information transmission can be really helpful for like unknown unknowns where you don't even know that you don't know something. And so those terms will be popping up sort of throughout as I describe some of the themes that we developed. And so the first theme that I developed in this was that navigating the interactions required to access information is challenging. And this focuses on how participants talked about interactions and the ways in which that information related to resources and opportunities can be seen as missing. And in the second theme, access to information is limited by university expectations. I'm going to discuss how the university structures information access and what these policies and practices might imply about the university's expected student. And I'll share some of the examples of the experiences that participants shared with us that led us to construct the expectations that I'm going to discuss. And I'll just note here that in some of the quote attributions, you see that I'll use person first language, and in others I'll use identity first language. This is because we asked participants how they would like to be referred to. And in the end, it ended up being about a 50-50 split for identity first and person first language preference. So university students are required to navigate daily interpersonal interactions to access information and resources. And participants shared experiences that suggested that these interactions were challenging and that they required significant effort and accommodation on the part of participants. And when describing these interactions, participants often identified individual characteristics as the cause of difficulty that they experienced. So for example, participants brought up that they had a slower processing speed or that they had difficulty interpreting body language. And the phrasing very much focused on sort of them as an individual. And so for an example, one woman with autism shared, I feel like I don't fit in because I'm not like catching on as quickly as other people because I'm a little like longer to process. This was pretty consistent that participants focused on what about themselves could be causing difficulties they experience when interacting. And these experiences that they shared occurred in both informal social settings as well as informal academic settings. And so a lot of the development of this theme was moving from a more semantic orientation of participants' experiences, so taking sort of what they said explicitly, to moving towards a more latent analysis, what norms might be underlying the experiences they shared with us, and how does this focus that they shared on sort of the individual level relate to what we know about reciprocity and the double empathy problem. And so when I was developing this theme, I was considering the experiences and the individual characteristics participants identified in the context of reciprocal exchanges. So if someone feels that their processing speed is slow, for example, that suggested to us that there might be a norm regarding how quickly someone should respond to an interaction. And if there's a lack of sort of allowance for deviation from this norm, which is what a lot of our participants' experiences suggested, that this can contribute to negative social and other outcomes for the participants, as well as impacting their access to information. We know that like English conversational turns, those occur extremely quickly in the form of milliseconds, and that any pauses tend to be evaluated negatively by an interaction partner. We heard about examples of being slower to process and respond to text messages that resulted in missing out on information about rides to social events or networking events. In academic group work, participants said that they didn't know when to speak up or they were spoken over or ignored by peers. And this can really hinder some of the opportunities for formal information behavior that contribute to group-based project learning, as well as informal information behaviors that allow for more casual information exchanges that can occur outside of the classroom. And continuing this with this more latent approach to the data and constructing reciprocity in how participants experience difficulty when they're attempting to gain information about resources and opportunities. We found that some participants would share experiences where they had initially gained access to a resource or an opportunity, but they were unable to fully access it. And looking across different participants' accounts of these scenarios, we found that participants seem to be talking about not having access to the right kind of information, or that the information that they did have access to was incomplete in some way. So for example, one man with autism shared that he felt there aren't as many opportunities to be social as I would like. The club listing doesn't really say anything specific about examples of how to reach out and things like that. And I felt I don't really know how to reach out. And another participant, sort of along the same vein, shared that they had been approved for an accommodation to get allergy-friendly food from the dining hall, but because they didn't have any guidelines on what kinds of food they could request, they only felt comfortable asking for quick things like grilled cheese sandwiches. And so we looked at these and other scenarios as participants encountering sort of incomplete information, because information about who can attend a club, or what kind of food one can request, for example, as well as information about how they could remedy this missing information wasn't available. And so we sort of looked at this as these scenarios might represent like a catch-22 of help seeking. You need a certain amount of information to be able to effectively seek information. And we sort of wound up on this path, in that research suggests that autistic people have a preference for explicit compared to implicit information. We see this in some experimental studies as well as in some qualitative accounts. So while the amount of information provided might be sufficient for some non-autistic people, our participants didn't find the amount or the type of information they needed to sort of move forward with. And so you might ask, like, why didn't participants just ask for help from a peer or contact the Disability Resource Office to clarify how to use their accommodation, for example? One reason could be that some research has shown autistic people to be more risk averse compared to non-autistic people, particularly when the potential for a negative outcome and the likelihood for that outcome occurring is unknown. So for example, if you've not received useful information in the past, or someone has been unkind to you when you ask for clarification, you might be reluctant to seek help in the future. Or if it's been very unpredictable whether help you ask for is actually given, that might also contribute to a reluctance to seek out this missing information. And when we look at literature for help seeking with non-autistic people, we can also see that like high levels of uncertainty are associated with conservative and suboptimal information seeking strategies. And so one question that we thought people might have after reading or hearing about this first theme is, couldn't a lot of participants' difficulties with accessing information be chalked up to participants failing to take initiative? And we really don't think so from considering participant interviews as a whole. A lot of participants seemed like they showed a lot of initiative across a wide variety of their college experiences. And specific context about some of the examples that I gave was participant who was interested in more social opportunities. He sought out information on websites and other forums. When the club fair was inaccessible to him, he still couldn't find the information. The participant with allergy accommodations, they went through the initial and effortful process to register with disability services for this accommodation in the first place, even though it wasn't able to fully address their needs. So it seems to us that participants did show quite a bit of initiative. And so from these experiences and others across the data set, we are proposing that it's not a failure of individual level information behaviors that are preventing participants from fully engaging with resources and opportunities, but that one of the barriers to information access seems to be a misalignment between processing abilities, information needs, and expectations that structure university practices and policies. And this is sort of what led us to the development of the second theme. And this one was particularly constructed with a more latent approach. With a few exceptions, participants didn't explicitly call out structural or institutional expectations or norms that they identified. But in looking across the data set of the experiences participants shared, we were able to organize difficulties that participants had in accessing information into potential expectations that could be held by the university. And in the literature, this is sometimes called the university's implied student. And just as in the existing literature with other marginalized populations, for example, first-generation college students, some of our participants indicated an awareness that they did not match this implied student or the expectations that they felt from the university. So for example, this autistic man shared that it does feel like there's an assumption of neurotypicality. The presumed standard university student is someone I'm not evidently similar to. So it does kind of feel like I'm trying to integrate myself into a system that wasn't really optimized for me. And I've shared one of the most explicit examples here, but most participants used more vague language than the phrasing used here. But this really spurred us to consider, like, how can we read assumptions of neurotypicality in the experiences that participants shared with us? And so research with other marginalized populations suggests that students who more closely align with university expectations more easily move through university contexts. So for example, with regard to sense of belonging or their ability to demonstrate academic abilities. And in this theme, we first considered expectations that inform classroom practices and other academic spaces. University classrooms are pretty clearly a very information-rich environment. There's a lot of opportunity for both formal and informal information behaviors. Many participants shared with us that, particularly when classes were structured to incorporate a lot of group-based learning activities or other activities that required social engagement for the learning or the grade outcomes, that they very much struggled. And given that a lot of models of student engagement are increasingly encouraging highly interactive learning activities, about every teaching professional development session I've been to recently has been about sort of active and engaged learning. We're sort of suggesting that universities are expecting that all students are going to be able to effectively learn from these social interactions. Like I said, one autistic woman found that these practices were not very effective for her. She instead spent a lot of energy self-regulating, and this can sort of sap cognitive resources that now can't be used for information processing and encoding. She says, I have a lot of group work and group interactions. It gets a lot more exhausting with things like science labs, which are very, very collaborative group environments, where I feel like it does take a lot of work for me to maintain composure. And we know with research with other college students who don't necessarily fit the university's implied or expected student, for example, students who are older than what's considered a traditional college student, that educational practices and signals that suggest you're not who the university is expecting can impede students' ability to demonstrate academic competence and to access resources that could facilitate their success. And so by expecting students to learn effectively through the same kind of social interactions, we're suggesting that the university is encouraging classroom practices that may impede autistic students' access to formal and tacit or more casual information, both through the nature of the practices, but also the feelings of misalignment with expectations that underlie those practices. Universities also provide students with information about resources and opportunities outside of the classroom. So a lot of universities, my undergraduate UVA, others that I know of as well, structure sort of mass information transmission events such as orientation or welcome week or club fairs. And there seems to be an expectation from how these are structured that students should be able to tolerate and process information in loud, crowded spaces. And it's probably not surprising to anyone here, a lot of our participants indicated that these events did not allow for their full participation. Participants shared experiences of only being able to briefly attend events due to the sensory environment, of not being able to find the information that they needed amongst all the activity, or of not being able to attend events at all. So for example, this autistic woman said, orientation events at the beginning of the year were difficult for me because of the sheer number of people and noise. I think I could have gone if I wanted to, but high volume and highly populated events are difficult for me because of sensory issues. So for her, the noise and the crowds were just not worth facing. And it's not, in my opinion, unlikely or unreasonable that an autistic person may decide that the anxiety or the pain associated with these events is just not worth it. But then they risk beginning the semester being unaware of resources and opportunities that could benefit them. And we know from work with non-autistic college students that not attending orientation events is associated with lower grades at the end of the first year. Student organization involvement, which is also often initiated at these large club fairs, is associated with university success and development of close friendships. And close peer relationships serve as what can be called hot information sources. So these are people that students are most likely to trust and seek out support from. And these relationships allow for informal information sharing and are particularly useful for learning about those unknown unknowns, information that you didn't know you were missing. So if you're unable to spend much time at or to attend at all events that serve as resource and social networking hubs, you're probably going to have fewer opportunities to develop the relationships that can provide long-term support through their roles as hot information sources. And finally, participants had a lot to say about their experience with disability-related resources. And we identified two expectations that seem to influence their experiences. You'll notice here that I speak more broadly about disability than autism specifically, and this is because most of our participants spoke broadly or were multiply disabled and didn't attempt to distinguish how different experiences may have been specific to autism or related to other disabilities that they experience. So first, one of the things that we proposed from the data was that universities are expecting most students to be non-disabled people. And statistically, this is reasonable. The majority of people in the world are non-disabled, but the lack of funding for disability resource offices suggests a significant underestimate and undercommitment to what could be as large as a 20% portion of students who have a disability. Across the US, university disability resource offices have an average of 6 staff members. At UVA, we have over 1,200 students registered. And so, you know, that's just not a sustainable ratio. We had several participants who were in the process of attempting to register with disability services, but faced barriers such as no intake appointments being available, being told their documentation for lifelong disabilities was too old, or being unable to afford testing in the first place. And I have thoughts about all of those, but won't get into that here. And leading into the second component of disability resource related expectations is the assumption that for the few disabled students the university does acknowledge existing, they're going to already be familiar with navigating resources to meet their additional needs. And I say additional, and I have it in scare quotes because this is how we're interpreting the university as perceiving disability and related resources. And so we constructed this expectation as participants shared a lot of the times that they didn't realize they were eligible for accommodations or had misconceptions about what the office did. So for example, some participants thought the disability resource office was only for students with learning disabilities, or that the only thing they provided was extra time on tests. This participant said during the course of our interview with him and another man with autism that it was only at that moment in this conversation that he realized he would have been eligible and could have benefited from accessing disability-related resources. But that for him, it felt like I'm assumed to be a normal student that doesn't need disability-related resources. So the university never really spent a lot of time and effort explaining to me that I still might be able to make a lot of effective use out of disability-related resources. And indeed, research suggests that disseminating information about available resources to disabled students is one of the least commonly endorsed activities by disability resource offices. And from a business and management perspective, if you have very limited funding and very limited personnel, limiting access to information, even if it's passive, is one way to maintain a more manageable caseload. For disabled university students who haven't previously received accommodations and who succeed in registering with their university's disability services office, so we're already at a small subsample here, it still may be unclear how to actually use approved accommodations. This autistic agender participant shared, I don't really know what the line is in terms of asking for an extension from my formally approved accommodations for a class versus asking as a normal student. And so the university's expectation that the relatively few disabled students who are present are already going to know how to use resources to support themselves effectively means that university students' prior experience or lack thereof with receiving accommodations is really going to heavily influence their understanding of and their access to disability-related resources. We also saw examples of this in terms of the expectation of non-academic accommodations, such as like getting a single dorm room, where the process and amount of student required coordination was seen as overwhelming by some students, and assumed a lot of background knowledge for navigating and integrating systems. And quite a few of our students just didn't know that this was an available accommodation that the university granted at all. And so to briefly summarize, through constructing the first theme, we found participants shared experiences that we constructed as reciprocal misalignment that sort of goes nicely with some of the experimental work showing difficulties that occur when autistic and non-autistic people interact. However, our participants tended to describe and interpret these experiences as being due to their individual autistic characteristics. And the experiences that participants shared with us also provided insight into what we saw as expectations of neurotypicality and how these expectations may translate into practices and policies that impede autistic students' access to information and subsequent resources and opportunities. And I found it really interesting to consider, particularly in the paper that I'm writing up of this, participants' experiences and particularly expectations that we constructed as instances of information marginalization. And this refers to the idea that certain individuals or groups are systematically excluded from access to information that's necessary for them to fully participate in society. And through this framework of information marginalization, we can really start to explore how institutional level factors contribute to the structural inequalities that limit autistic university students' ability to meet their informational needs and thus to access those resources and support. And so when those needs go unmet, we're proposing that that is partially contributing to some of the difficulties that autistic students are experiencing in accessing supports that are present. And so that is where I will leave it. I would love to hear any questions or thoughts you have. If you want me to go deeper into any of sort of what I talked about, I'd love to spend these last 15 minutes or so hearing your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Absolutely fantastic, Kayden. I think there were a lot of head nods and snaps and yeses going on, because I think a lot of what you share here resonates with individuals' experiences, and certainly kind of enlightening the importance of not only access to information, but perhaps kind of re-envisioning expectations. I want to illustrate that during your presentation, there were a lot of comments regarding how people could appreciate what you said and hadn't thought about certain ways of operationalizing experiences that the participants illuminated in your work. But we are definitely going to encourage folks to share their questions either verbally or in the chat. We'll get it started with Lee, who asks, would you say your respondents prefer to have the help of disability professionals, or would they prefer to advocate for themselves?
I'd say probably a mix. A lot of people did seem to want access to some kind of formalized support from the university. There's definitely also concerns of stigma, either through engaging with disability resource offices or what a lot of participants were interested, or what some participants were interested in also, is the opportunity to meet other autistic college students, to sort of relate to each other and benefit from sort of that identity and experience relate specific knowledge. But again, that would sometimes be paired with a desire for, it'd be great to have a space where we could do this. But I would also be nervous about other people finding out or seeing me use this space. And so I think, it was definitely like a tension between wanting formal support, but being nervous of who would find out about them accessing this support.
Yeah, that notion of stigma is still very explicit and very common, given even in this environment where there's higher autism awareness, but the acceptance isn't always there. Um, and it looks like Ava comments it could be something like peer mentoring between different autistic students or neurodivergent students and disabled students.
Mhm. Yeah, and our campus does have a Student Disability Alliance, which is sort of like a cross disability student group. But we didn't specifically ask our participants if they were aware of this group, but I definitely encountered outside of the study students who didn't know it existed. I'm sure the sort of same stigma concerns would exist. I think some of the ways that they've been trying to sort of counter that, in addition to sort of COVID safety, is having some of their events on Zoom, and that like there's no room, to be seen walking in and out of it, so comparatively a little bit more private.
As we're waiting for some other questions to come in, oh, here we go. We have one from Lauren. I'll read it verbally here. Lauren asks, says, as someone who works in a university disability-related service office, I 100% agree with the observations you made about the underestimation of the amount of disabled students, resulting in a lack of resources for the disability office, leading to gatekeeping information about disability-related services. I'm wondering if you could say more about this issue and what steps we could take to raise awareness and make information more accessible.
Yeah, so this was as I was working on writing my thesis and working with some of the great undergraduates who've also worked on this project. We read Dolmage's Academic Ableism book, and he talks some about this as well. But just like, I think one comparison that stuck out in my mind was like the average funding for disability services offices in the US was somewhere around $250,000 at the time of that study, which was a few years ago. But that is less than the median salary of like university chancellors. And just like, an entire office that could potentially be serving 20% of the population, that at UVA serves 10% of the population, being less than, some singular people in the administration make, was just not shocking to me, but particularly to see it laid out in concrete terms was just very frustrating. I know that our university has just, one of the things they want is like, where is the data that the students exist, that they want, not necessarily disability resource office services, but like, more social groups or a disability cultural center, sort of that, as they've been very, where is the data, which sort of, as I mentioned, can be hard when, testing is expensive, or assessments have a very specific kind of autistic person in mind, or people are worried about stigma with using the office at all. So it's even harder to sort of capture those numbers. I know that at my undergraduate university, one sort of attempt that they made to sort of at least publicize the information more was, sending out information about the Disability Resource Office in like the acceptance packet that students received, so that it didn't fall on students or parents to reach out to find out about it. They sort of had website audits about like where's the information on the website? Does it make sense? Is it easy to access? I know my experience as a graduate student is oftentimes there's at least fairly direct link to what's the steps for an undergraduate accommodation request, but in the graduate realm, it was a little more murky if you need accommodations for your role as a teacher, for example, or accommodations for your oral dissertation defense. Those tended to not be mentioned, and so yeah, some of the finding out of information was difficult depending on the level. So I think sort of the website audit was helpful, and sort of broadening who is doing those sort of audits as well, so people can point out, well, you're sort of missing this section of the population, and I think potentially also contribute to some of that sort of missing information that I talked about, and that it may seem clear to somebody working in the office who maybe doesn't personally have a disability, but somebody who has lived experience might read the information and not have enough to sort of move forward in an actionable manner.
Yeah, absolutely. And Beth kind of reinforces as far as university websites being notoriously difficult to navigate. And actually, my colleague Kirsten Brown and I wrote about that a few years ago about how college websites need to be more accessible for autistic students, but also have content more visibly so that they can find stuff about them that resonates with their experiences. So it's nice to hear that University of Virginia is taking that as more of a priority. We have several other questions in the chat. First from Wes. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that apparent tension between the trend of higher ed recommending more active student engagement with the needs of autistic learners for processing information in different ways. So did your participants share their thoughts about that? For example, ways of navigating group work, or have any recommendations about how to reconcile that?
Yeah, that's something that I also grapple with, in that, group work is a common expectation. It was also a common experience that participants found to be particularly difficult for them. Depending on what job you're seeking, group work might be a reality of that job. And so it's something that I've definitely not fully fleshed out my thoughts or recommendations on. I mean, I guess one thing that comes to mind is incorporating more aspects of universal design, providing multiple options for students to demonstrate mastery of the course material. But in terms of specifics, it's something that I honestly have not come to a full conclusion about. And even as someone who does teaching, figuring the pedagogy that I believe in and subscribe to, and sometimes the amount of time and energy that I have to actually do the teaching and the prep work do not always align. So I sort of see a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of different facets of the issue that I am still figuring out how to navigate myself.
Yeah, indeed, that is difficult. We probably have time for both Eric's question and Nat's question. Eric asks, or starts off by saying, it's hard to overstate the role of anxiety in accessing resources. The university may believe it has shared adequate information. So for instance, here's the time and place of club meetings, but the student may have countless unanswered questions. So will the other students there already know each other? What level of knowledge are members expected to have? What actually takes place at meetings? Will I be expected to speak in front of the group, et cetera? So I guess that's more of a statement than a question, but I'm not sure if you want to perhaps react to that.
No, I think it's right on point, and was definitely what some of our participants shared were those sort of questions exactly. Was the meeting time, the location were on the website, but that, like I said, was not enough information for them to feel comfortable actually attending the meeting in sort of those levels of uncertainty. And for them reaching out to a peer or a club officer, or however your university phrases it, were not things that they were comfortable with. Some of which I think might relate to in non-autistic people, but I think might be relevant for our participants, is that when help seeking is seen as non-normative, people are really reluctant to do it. And so a lot of our participants made statements that suggested they thought of their non-autistic peers as being good social people. They had access to secret social scripts. They've quickly found social nieces. Socializing was very easy for other people. And so for them, I think it very easily could have been seen as it would be unusual for me to ask this question about what other people don't care about or can easily adapt to. And I don't want to seem different like that.
You're sharing a lot that definitely resonates. Nat's question is regarding information behavior. Do autistic individuals that participate in information behavior, or any of your participants for that matter, often find themselves over communicating information to other people, perhaps as a sort of trying to give the detailed information that they wish they were receiving?
I think it's a super great question. I think about it but even before I was sort of formalizing this in information behavior, just in my own experiences, there is very little research specifically on autistic people and information behavior, and almost all of it is in the context of academic libraries. So in terms of like research knowledge of that, not a whole lot, but several of our participants did comment that they had experiences with other students where they had been made to feel badly because of providing too much information or going on what other people saw as tangents, or over explaining themselves, and that other people had sort of made them feel badly for communicating in that manner.
Indeed. Let's see. Beth has a question. If the curriculum calls for group work, would a request for working individually be an accommodation or substantial change to the curriculum and thus not allowed?
I think it's really going to depend on what your professor thinks. In courses that I've TA'd, last semester, a student asked if they could do an individual project instead, and we allowed that. We worked a little bit more closely just to make sure that they were on track, given that they didn't have group members who might be able to offer feedback like that doesn't make sense or this doesn't mesh with what we learned. But to us, it was seen as a reasonable accommodation and not a substantial change. But I could see other professors that I know very easily considering the group work an essential component of the course. So I think that's like one of the unfortunate, like very murky considerations that the accommodation denials sort of can fall into.
I think since we're a couple of minutes from the hour mark, we'll wrap up there, but asking folks to insert in the chat their appreciation for your time, Kayden. Excellent. I'm really excited to see this work be shared out further.
And so let me just, I'll put my contact info if anyone would like to chat more about this. And I'd also just like to acknowledge the other members of the research team, Zoe Robertson, Andrew Lampy, Taylin Steinman, Anushay Ahmed, and Erwin Morgan, as well as my advisor, Vikram Jaswal, who worked on this. We received funding from UVA's Directors of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and I also received an APS Student Grant Award to fund this project. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Morten Ann Gernsbacher, as well as Dr. Kristen Gillespie-Wrench and her students for consultations that we had with them early on about participatory research and autistic college students. So I just want to acknowledge all of the great contributions that those people made.
Very, very appropriate. And it seems like a bunch of your colleagues were here today to support you as well. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. We will see you in February on Friday, February 17th at noon Eastern time. Eleanor Lim, who joined us today, doctoral student at the University of Portsmouth, is going to be presenting on supporting autistic university students, perspectives of autistic students and disability support staff. And then in March, we are celebrating our 5th anniversary for Canvas, and we have an exciting panel in store for everybody. So we look forward to having you join in for those and subsequent presentations, and we'll see you on the Canvas listserv. Again, the presentation the next month is Friday, February 17th at 12 p.m. Eastern time. And we look forward to having you there. Have a good weekend, everybody, and we'll see you soon.